Today on CityCast Madison. You might have heard of a NIMBYer, the not in my backyard crowd. People who like the idea of something like affordable housing, so long as the development's not going to affect their neighborhood. Let me introduce you to a new crowd. Will Ochowicz got very interested in Madison's housing policy after he couldn't afford to buy a house here. He started a group called Madison is for People, and he wants to change our zoning code to allow more development and more housing in his neighborhood and across the city. Dylan Brogan caught up with him to learn why. It's Tuesday, April 23rd. I'm Molly Stentz, and here's what Madison's talking about.
Will, thank you for joining me on CityCast Madison.
Thank you for having me, Dylan.
So I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had some flare-ups over development, even potential development in the Madison area right now. So what do you make of that? Why are we seeing some pushback?
Yeah, I have actually noticed that. This is basically the reason why I started the group, Madison is for People. I think one of the biggest reasons that you see flare-up is people are afraid. And fear motivates people, but it also distorts people's perceptions. And so...
What's the fear? Yeah,
it's usually, when it comes to housing, the main things, and if you go to develop meetings that developers hold or that the city holds before development happens, you'll hear the same things over and over. It's usually parking, traffic. Sometimes people are afraid of affordable housing, or there's a mix of classism and racism involved in that. Not always. I do think most people are arguing in good faith and are just genuinely afraid of their neighborhood changing. And a lot of people chose their neighborhood because they like it. It's understandable that they would be afraid, but it's usually parking, traffic, and they're afraid that the neighborhood is going to change, and they don't know how it's going to change, and they don't have control over how it's going to change.
Fear over change seems fair.
Yes. But on the other hand, we can't never change things. A city is kind of like an organism. It grows, it develops, parts of it change, parts of it get better, maybe parts of it go through hard times. Actually, Tenny Lapham went through this. In the 70s, the city was paying people to move into Tenny Lapham because nobody wanted to live there. And now it's a booming, bustling neighborhood. So, cities they're complicated things. You can't necessarily expect to control every aspect of it, but...
Yeah, no, I hear you. And we'll get more into that fear of change thing, but things are changing. A lot of people are moving here. The housing situation isn't what it used to be in Madison. It's a lot harder. It's just more expensive. So what should Madison be doing to make it more affordable to live here?
Part of the reasons that Madison is becoming more unaffordable are Madison is growing. There are a lot of really good, high-paying jobs. We have a really high quality of life here, and people want that. And so they're willing to pay more to move here and get that. But on the downside, we have a lot of people who live here who want to stay, but maybe can't necessarily afford those higher prices. In order to increase affordability, the way I view it is there's two separate crises. So there's this broader housing prices are going up. It's becoming harder for everyone to afford housing. And then there's this really acute crisis of people who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum. They really cannot afford to stay here. And so to increase affordability, there's really two paths I think the city needs to take. One is broadly making it easier to build housing in all neighborhoods. And we talk about the missing middle, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. But the missing middle is sort of in between like a single family home and a apartment building. So it could be like a duplex. It could be like a 4-unit building. It could be cottage courts. And these are the sorts of things that our zoning code right now does not allow in the majority of the city. I think this comes into the fear aspect, but zoning is complicated. I think people think of zoning as single family homes versus apartments versus commercial, but it also controls all these other aspects like the form of the building, the setbacks, the lot size minimums, the height, what you can do in there. Zoning controls it basically controls the entire built environment of our city. And I think people don't quite understand the impacts that it has on how they live their life.
And so when we're terms of tangible solutions of how we could get more housing, because I think people want this to be an affordable city to live in, regardless of your current situation. So is the problem that the zoning laws are too strict? There's too much regulation on proposed developments? Or is it that these neighborhoods have too much control?
I think the issue is that the zoning is too strict in some aspects. Zoning isn't objective. Most of what we have for our zoning code is not an objective process. It's a political process. And we're seeing that play out, especially in the West Area Plan. And so what I would encourage the city to do, and I know some alders are looking at this, is follow the paths of other cities and look at how can we enable and make it easy for missing middle development to be built throughout the city. So, for instance, Houston in the 90s, they used to have 5,000 square foot lot size minimums, which means if you want to build a house, you need a parcel of land that's at least 5,000 square feet. They updated that and they made it 1,500 square feet, I think. The exact number might be wrong, but what that enabled developers in the city of Houston to do, and by developers, it's not big developers. A lot of these people are just tradespeople. They're general contractors who are going to buy a house and develop a plot of land. It enabled them to build townhomes. And so these neighborhoods in Houston that were formerly single family homes on larger lots became townhomes, and that they became affordable townhomes too. It enabled people to move into Houston and for the population to grow without running into the issue of forcing people out in order to bring new people in. That's just an example of the sort of reform that I would encourage them to do. Townhomes are not even allowed in most of Madison, so that's another thing that would need to change.
Okay, so your group is advocating for the possibility of more options.
Yes.
Like duplexes and quadplexes, and we're not necessarily talking about 20-story apartment buildings in residential neighborhoods.
No, we're not necessarily talking about that. Although, especially on commercial corridors and near the bus rapid transit route, we are encouraging that.
Not 20 stories, come on.
I
know you're a YIMBY, but that's a little much.
I don't even know if we have a 20-story building in Madison.
They're getting up there, but not quite that much. But okay, just to be fair to these, because we've seen some pushback from neighborhood organizations that are worried that the character of their neighborhood is changing. And that means like going from a single family home neighborhood to maybe there being some apartments that are 3-4 stories tall on a busier street. So shouldn't the people of Madison have a little bit of say in the development in their cities, and that these neighborhoods, we need their input on how this should look? I mean, aren't you sympathetic to that to some extent?
Yeah, I am sympathetic to that to some extent. There's two things I would say to that. One is that I personally really strongly feel that neighborhood character is not made up of the buildings in a neighborhood, but by the people who inhabit them. And so neighborhood character is just not something that you can set in stone because people are born, they die, they live their lives, they move. You can't set that in stone. And so this idea that neighborhood character is made up of buildings, I don't think it's right. On the other hand, there is a lot to be said about, for instance, people go through cycles in their lives. So for the input aspect of it, a lot of people need a diversity of housing types. So for instance, most people at some point in their lives live in an apartment. You also have this issue of a lot of empty nesters in Madison who have homes that are too big for them and they want to move into something smaller, but they don't want to leave their neighborhood. And so they need those options throughout their neighborhood to be able to move into a condo or an apartment. Actually, in Tenny Lapham, I know multiple people who have moved from single family homes into some of the newer apartment buildings on East Washington. And by doing so, they have freed up their homes for a family to move into. It's sort of like musical chairs where everybody has different needs. Those needs are not static throughout their life. There's needs change when people get married, when they have children, if they get divorced, when their kids move out.
Yeah, they don't want to shovel the sidewalk during the winter. They'd rather have that taken care of. Okay, so what is the goal of your group, Madison, is for people?
So I think there's two parts. One is education. And so it's meeting people where they are and talking to them about how these changes can benefit them. So for instance, what I was saying before about people needing different building types throughout their life. You don't want to shovel the sidewalk. You don't want to mow the lawn. You don't want to clean a huge house. You need housing options to facilitate that. And to do that, you need new buildings. And to do that, you need zoning that allows new buildings. So educating people on how these things can benefit them in maybe subtle ways is one goal of the group. The other goal of the group is advocating with alders at Plan Commission, at Urban Design Commission, at Common Council to advocate for these changes.
Well, and your group is part of a broader YIMBY movement, right? You're Yes in My Backyard, as opposed to NIMBY, which is Not in My Backyard. So what's motivating these attitudes towards development?
I think a lot of people are upset at just how difficult it is to build housing. If you were to look at the hierarchy of needs, housing is at the bottom. It's a basic need, and everyone needs it. And getting back to the fear factor, you have a lot of fear over the built environment because people have invested a lot of money into their housing and they love their neighborhood. But on the other hand, it's a basic need. People need housing. And if you show up to a housing meeting, so much of it is not focused on what's good for the neighborhood or even what's good for, you never hear about what's the people who would live in the new housing. They have no one to advocate for them. So you go to a meeting and you'll hear people who are upset about all these things. And then if you go to the same place 2-3 years after the housing is built, usually none of the fears have played out. Usually the neighborhood is better off. It's a little bit more lively. You have, maybe younger people walking around. It just feels nicer. I think about the Near East Side of Madison. Most of the neighborhoods like Marquette and Tenny Lapham, even Emerson East, and some of the near West Side neighborhoods, you cannot build those today. And it's because of these pretty restrictive zoning rules.
Well, what do you mean you can't build these today? Like apartment buildings within those single-family home neighborhoods?
Yeah, so most of Madison developed after, the post-war era is zoned suburban residential, with the exception of like commercial corridors. But when you think about those Near East neighborhoods, those neighborhoods that developed before zoning, what you have are small lot sizes. You have a mix of single-family homes, townhomes, apartment buildings, and they all mingle together and they fit together really well. But you can't do that in newer neighborhoods because they only allow one specific form, which is a single-family home on a larger lot set back in a suburban style. And so zoning, it prevents those neighborhoods from changing in basically any way, except for rebuilding a home.
So your group is Madison for the people, but more options for Madison's people. Something,
yes.
Perhaps the subhead. Okay.
Yes.
So how did you, you're a young guy. Well, how did you first start following Madison's planning and zoning? It feels like, it's easy not to pay attention to these things unless like there is a development about to happen in your neighborhood and that gets people riled up. Beyond that, we don't see people thinking about this very proactively, do we? So how did you get started in it?
I got started because it was COVID. It was lockdown. I didn't have much to do. So I was looking at houses on Zillow and thinking, oh my gosh, these are so expensive. How am I ever going to buy a home in Madison?
So you thought, I'll look at the zoning laws.
Yes. I started showing up to public meetings, just listening to Plan Commission. And again, you hear what motivated me is you just hear the same things over and over. And so much of it is not related to what I would think is good for the city, is good for everyone broadly. It's usually something like, this building is going to take away my street parking. And, sometimes you just want to be like, well, you have a driveway, so why does it matter that much? But you listen to these meetings over and over and you hear the same arguments over and over. And then you must start to wonder why there are so few housing options in Madison. And it becomes a little bit more apparent. And then you learn about parking minimums, which the city has done a good job of eliminating for the most part. But parking minimums and single family zoning and all these different requirements that make it more difficult and add costs to the end construction of a building.
Do you ever worry about being accused of carrying water for developers? Because, hey, every building that's built, they're not doing it just for kicks. You know, they're trying to make a profit on it. I mean, how do you square that? If you need more housing, you need someone to build it. I get that. But there used to be kind of a stronger anti-development leaning among progressives in Madison, that they were worried about developers, you know, shaping too much of things and profit being too much at the center of it. So I guess how do you square that?
So just an anecdote, but I was talking with a larger infamous developer in Madison, and I asked him about zoning, and he did not care. You know, he doesn't care about zoning because he knows how to get through plan commission. He knows how to get his buildings built. Where I think this is an issue is you have a lot of people who want to do something small in their neighborhood. I talk to people who want to build an ADU.
An accessory dwelling unit.
An accessory dwelling unit. It's basically a little garage apartment, mother-in-law flat, granny flat. They want to build something like that, and zoning just a few years ago made it so difficult to do. They've made it a little bit easier. Talk to people who they live in a single family home. They're getting older. They would like to build something that is accessible to themselves. So AARP actually has a lot of really good resources on what makes a home useful for aging in place. You know, it doesn't necessarily make sense to them to tear down a single family home and build a single family home. Maybe they want to build a 4-unit building and live in one of the units. And those other 3 people will help pay for, those other 3 units will help pay for the construction costs and help make it easier for them to age in place. But they can't do it. So I could understand the accusation, but I don't think it's accurate. I think actually there's a lot of these really small things that don't happen because of zoning, and they're more like everyday people. Even the neighborhoods that we live in, you know, every neighborhood essentially was built by a developer for money. I can count on one hand the number of people who have built their own homes that I've met. And so if you're living in a home, it didn't just pop out of the sky. Someone built it for money, and that's how it got built.
Capitalism. Yeah. Okay.
Capitalism.
So it's just funny that it sounds like they're in your group, and I know it's not just you, it's other people who are concerned about providing more options through our zoning laws and other ways to address the housing crisis. But some people I just know who are just a little bit shocked at the pace of things. They think there's so much being built everywhere, and that, you know, that it's going too fast, that there's this rush, and that's going to change the character of Madison. But it sounds like the exact opposite of what you're saying, like, is that we're not building fast enough. Meanwhile, people are freaking out because it seems like so much is changing so quickly.
Yeah, and I can understand that. I think that partially comes from, you see a few large apartment buildings, especially on Regent Street or East Washington or University Ave. But you can look at the cities, their housing snapshot, and look at where apartments are built. And there are, you know, square miles of the city where there's been no new construction. So I think this sort of gets back to the missing middle as an ideal for incremental development within existing neighborhoods. The city should absolutely be building more, especially along commercial corridors and bus rapid transit. Those are ideal opportunities that reduces carbon emissions if people are able to take the bus instead of driving a car. You know, an apartment uses much less energy than a single family home just because you're sharing walls. So from the perspective of ecological impact, an apartment is a really good option. And it also helps save our city from sprawling. So it saves farm fields and forests on the edge of the city from being turned into subdivisions for new development.
And creating more of these traffic issues that we see.
And creating more traffic issues, yeah.
So for a Madisonian that bought their house in the 70s or 80s or 90s, maybe even 20 years ago, what do you wish they understood about folks that are just trying to start their lives here and get a foothold here and really build a place of their own in Madison?
Yeah, One thing I want to make clear is I don't think this is a young versus old issue. I talked about aging in place a little bit, but there are plenty of members of our group who are homeowners, who are older, and who they want to see their friends be able to stay in the city. They want to see their kids, when they grow up, be able to buy a home in the city. I don't think it's a young versus old issue. I think that comes from, some of the people, the leaders of the YIMBY group being younger, and this just being a more acute issue for younger people, but it's definitely not a age thing. What I would want those people to understand is that this doesn't really require them to do anything. If someone else builds an apartment building, you don't have to do anything. You still have your home, you still have your driveway, you can do what you want. But it does give those options for people who are trying to make a life in the city. It makes it easier for them. It gives them options. It more broadly increases affordability just by increasing the housing supply. I talked a little bit about the carbon benefits of building closely, especially near transit. There are all these broad benefits to building housing where people want to live. And so to those people, I would say this is good for the city. It also is good for the people you care about.
So your group, Madison, is for, you're not taking over anybody's house. You're not coming in with bulldozers and putting up Soviet block style housing.
No, absolutely.
And you're not advocating for that.
And we're not advocating for that. Okay. What we are advocating for is making it easier for people who own their homes or own property to be able to build something denser. I'll say, yes, we're trying to make it easier to build more housing. You don't really need to do anything if you don't want to, but this does give more options for more people throughout the city.
All right. Hey, Will, thank you for taking the time just to explain your point of view on what can be some sticky issues in Madison as it indeed grows and changes. So thank you, Will.
Thank you, Dylan.
That's Dylan Brogan, speaking with Will Ochowicz, the founder of the grassroots group, Madison is for People. And hey, after we recorded this interview, guess what? The Madison City Council voted to allow more types of housing. You can now build an accessory dwelling unit in more areas of the city. That's city planner speak for like a mother-in-law cottage or a granny flat. We'll throw a link in our show note if you want the details. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Molly Stentz. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone new to town? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Ciao!